So the purpose of this video is kind of to highlight a breakdown of the history of the Quranic text. From the beginning, from the revelation until the end, until the compilation, until us reading the Quran today and looking at the text in front of us today. From revelation until compilation. That is the kind of the purpose of this video. And I'm going to rely on the primary source material, like the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ or the narrations of his companions, to do with the Quran or the Quranic text or the Qira'at and all of these issues, as well as some secondary sources, well accepted secondary sources from the classical tradition of Muslims. So this video is going to be divided into 4 parts. The first part of the video is going to be talking about the first parts of revelation, the revelation of the Quran until the end of the revelation. And then the second part is going to be talking about the first compilation of the Quran done by Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. Then the third part is going to be talking about Uthman and the standardization of the Quran that he did. And then the last part is going to talk about the 10 qira'at, 7 qira'at / 10 qira'at that we have today that we're reading. So it's going to be a breakdown, historical breakdown from the beginning until today. So it'll be a beneficial video, inshallah, for either people who are Muslims who are interested to understand how we have the 10 qira'at today, how we have the Quran that we have it today, or people who have had misinformation, false information, widespread, for them to correct their understanding of the Quranic text. So first, I'm going to begin speaking about the beginning of the revelation of the Quran. So Prophet ﷺ, he lived among his people for 40 years before revelation came down to him, before any part of the Quran came down to him. And he was known as the trustworthy, the honest. So he did not believe in idol worship. So he used to go into a cave, a secluded cave, and he used to try to worship God in whichever way he could. He used to go to a specific cave called the Cave of Hira, where he had the encounter with the angel Gabriel, the archangel Gabriel, which then the first few verses of the Quran were revealed. Read or recite in the name of your Lord. So this was the first encounter, the first part of the Quran, the first revelation to be ever revealed of the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ. And angel Gabriel told the Prophet ﷺ to recite this Quran. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ, he was frightened, so he went back to his wife at that time, Khadija, and then she took him to her relative, Waraq ibn Nawfal, who was someone from the people of the book. He was studying the books of the Christians and the Jews. Then Waraq ibn Nawfal, he confirmed to the Prophet ﷺ, he told him that the angel that came to you is the same angel that came to Moses, i.e. he brought to you revelation. And that was one of the only 1 or 2 times that Prophet ﷺ met Waraq ibn Nawfal, because he passed away later on. I thought I would mention that because a lot of Christians, they seem to think that the Prophet took the Quran from Waraq ibn Nawfal, even though the first encounter of revelation, Waraq was not there, and he died straight away after. So this was the first part of the Quran. Then angel Gabriel came to the Prophet ﷺ, and other parts of the Quran were revealed, like Surah Al-Muddathir, where Allah Azza wa Jal commanded the Prophet ﷺ to deliver the message. So first was to recite the Quran. And that's why the word the Quran is taken from reciting or reading. This is how the Quran is meant to be understood and transmitted. It is primarily an oral text. And through this breakdown that we're going to be talking about, you will see that the main way of preserving the Quran was through the oral tradition. It was not through the written text. The written text was always looked at as a secondary source. But we will be talking about the written text and as well as the oral text, inshallah. So this was the first parts, the first few revelations that came down from the Quran. Then the Quran came down gradually on a period of 23 years. As Allah Azza wa Jal, he mentions in the Quran, قُرْآنًا فَرْقَنَاهُ لِتَقْرَأَهُ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى مُكْثٍ. And the Quran that we divided, so you can recite gradually on the people, so people can gradually take it in, embrace it, and understand it. So the Quran took a 23-year period of being revealed. The first revelation was in the cave of Hira, and then it took 23 years being gradually revealed. Circumstantial events took place, and then the Quran was revealed, talking about them, etc. And whenever any part of the Quran came down, the Prophet ﷺ always commanded someone to write it down. Like Uthman radiallahu anh, he mentioned in his narration that whenever any part of the Quran was revealed, the Prophet ﷺ brought someone to write the Quran down, and he told him where to place these specific verses through the revelation. There was multitude of different people who were called specifically Katabat al-Wahy, writers of revelation. And these people were people the Prophet ﷺ selected. And whenever the Quran came down, he called one of them to come and write the Quran. One of them is, for example, Zayd ibn Thabit, Uthman radiallahu anh that we mentioned, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, multiple different companions of the Prophet ﷺ. There were many companions. and their job was to write down the Quran. So they were writing the Quran on any parchments, leather, rocks, wood, whatever was available at that time. Because at that time, like, papers were not available in the deserts of Arabia. So they were writing down on parchments. Wherever they could find any part, whenever the Quran is revealed, they bring a piece of leather, piece of wood, whatever it is, and then they write the Quran down on that piece. And then some of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ also had their own personal books, where they were writing some of the Quran, and they were writing also their interpretations, their understanding. So it was a mixture between the revelation of the Quran as well as their understanding, etc. And we'll come to that point later on, so keep it in mind that some of the companions had their own personal kind of books and masahif, where they had the Quran as well as explanation and understanding. For example, Aisha radiallahu anha, she had the Quran, and one of the verses of the Quran, she was saying, حَفِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَوَاتِ وَالصَّلَاةِ الْوُسْطَى صَلَاةِ الْعَصْرِ. So there was an extra part there that she was adding as an interpretation in her own personal mushaf, as well as Ubay ibn Ka'b and many of the other companions. They also had their own personal masahif that they used to write interpretation as well as the Quran also in these masahif. So after that gradual revelation was coming down, and the Prophet ﷺ commanded people to write parts of the Quran. Then Islam started to spread within the deserts of Arabia. So the Arabs at that time, they had multitude of different dialects. Just like today, you can look at the English or whichever language you want to look at, and you have different people in different parts of the world. They're all speaking English, but they are speaking different dialects of the same language. So that was the same case for the Arabs at the time. So when Islam spread to different tribes, Arab tribes like Tamim, etc., and then you had Quraysh, you had different tribes of the Arabs. And then when Islam spread, it was difficult for these other tribes that speak other dialects other than the dialect of Quraysh, which was the first dialect that the Quran was revealed in. It was difficult for these individuals and these people to recite the Quran in a dialect other than their own. So the Prophet ﷺ, what he did is that he started asking an angel Gabriel that we need more different ways of reciting the Quran. So basically, after that happened, and after Islam spread in all of these different tribes, there was a need for the Quran to also be easier for these people, because these people, you have the very old man, you have the very young child, and you have different people among them that cannot speak the dialect of Quraysh. It was difficult for them. So the Prophet ﷺ, he spoke with Angel Gabriel. He requested, he said, فَمَا زِلْتُ أَسْتَزِيدُهُ. I asked Angel Gabriel to ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make an easy way for us, for those individuals that are from different tribes that cannot speak the dialect of Quraysh. So what happened is that Allah Azza wa Jal revealed the Quran in 7 different dialects, which are also known as the 7 ahruf. So Allah Azza wa Jal can make it easier for the people to recite the Quran in their own dialect, if they're very old or they're a child, and it's very difficult for them to recite the Quran in a dialect other than their own. So as the hadith says, that the Prophet ﷺ, he asked Angel Gabriel, he said, فَمَا زِلْتُ أَسْتَزِيدُهُ. I kept requesting him to increase until he gave me 7 ahruf. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, he said, whichever dialect you would recite the Quran in, from these 7 dialects, you're correct. فَقَدْ أَصَابُوا. You're correct. There is no problem. Allah Azza wa Jal also gave the command, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْهُ. Recite whatever is easy for you. So you can recite from these different dialects, whatever is comfortable, whatever is easy for you as an individual. Because the whole reason for the Quran to be revealed in these 7 different dialects was to make it easy for the people. So then you could recite from these different dialects, whatever is easier for your tongue as an Arabic person. And here you can see a miracle that people can look at and can see that this Quran cannot be from Prophet Muhammad, because he was from the tribe of Quraysh. And as we know, even today, if you bring anyone like English or American or whatever it is, and you start telling him, start speaking to me in different dialects of English, start speaking to me in a Scottish dialect and Australian dialect, they're not going to be able to do it. They might do it for a few minutes, but then they will make mistakes. So how did the Prophet ﷺ recite the same Quran or bring revelation of the same Quran in 7 different dialects of the Arabs? We're talking about 6,000 verses here of the Quran, of the most eloquent speech to ever exist. So this by itself is a miracle for people of understanding, for people who have intellect, to see that this text could not have been coming from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself. So the Quran came down, and while it came down in these 7 different dialects, also Allah Azza wa Jal added more new features in these 7 ahruf that was revealed. For example, he revealed certain words different from the first revelation that he revealed. For example, these words increase the meaning or bring an additional meaning that enriches the meaning of the Quran. For example, the Quran says Maliki Yawmiddin, in the first chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha. It says Malik Yawmiddin and Malik Yawmiddin, the owner of the Day of Judgment and the King of the Day of Judgment. These two meanings do not contradict one another. They enrich the meaning of the Qur'an further. And also these dialects had different ways of reciting the same word. So it's the same exact word with the same dialectical marks and everything, but it's just the way you pronounce it is different. Like for example, you say Wadduha and you say Wadduhi. So depending on the dialect of the Arab tribe of the time. And also Allah Azza wa Jal had certain words read in a different way to also enrich and increase the meaning. For example, when Moses, he came to Pharaoh in the Qur'an, and he showed him the signs like the stick and all of the signs that Moses showed Pharaoh, he said to him in one recitation, لَقَدْ عَلِمْتَ, you know that no one revealed these signs except the Lord of the heavens and the earth. So you know that no one can reveal these miracles except the Creator. So here in one recitation, Moses is telling Pharaoh, you know. And in another recitation, he says, لَقَدْ عَلِمْتُ, I know. So Moses is speaking from the first person here, that he knows that no one else can reveal these miracles except the Lord of the heavens and the earth. So here we have an enriched meaning added to this verse. That Moses himself, he knows, he believes, he's certain that these signs came from the Creator. And also, the other recitation is that Pharaoh also knows this, even though he's denying. He also knows that these signs are coming from the Creator. So that is enriching and increasing the meaning of the Qur'an. And now, that's why you see Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was actually one of the 4 people that the Prophet ﷺ recommended that people take the Qur'an from, or take the recitations of the Qur'an from. So there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, take the Qur'an from 4 people, i.e. these 4 people are the best reciters. So one of them is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and Salim, right? These 4 people, the Prophet ﷺ said, take the Qur'an from them. They're the most eloquent in reciting. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, that I've seen the reciters in the beginning. I've seen these different ahraf, these different dialects of the Arab, these different revelations that came from Allah Azza wa Jal. And they're very close. They're like halum and aqbil, which both of these 2 words mean the same thing, which means come, but it's just different ways to say the same thing. And as we said, different words that are also enriching the meaning, like the king and the owner. So this was essentially the 7 ahraf. The 7 ahraf were 7 dialects that also added more unique words that enriches the meaning of the Qur'an, and unique ways of reciting certain words that adds and increases the meaning of the Qur'an. Now, the very important thing to understand here is that all of these different things are all considered Qur'an. So when we say there's only one Qur'an, there's only one Qur'an, because that is the same text, but it is recited in different ways. That is the same text, but these differences are all coming down from Allah. So Qur'an is that recitation of the text of the revelation that comes from Allah Azza wa Jal. That's what the Qur'an is. And all of these different ahraf, all of these 7 ahraf, all of these unique words like Malik and Malik, or Alimtu and Alimta, or Tabayyanu and Tathabbatu, all of these are coming from Allah, from Angel Gabriel. And the Prophet ﷺ recited them word for word. So when you look at different qira'at and you look at different recitations of the Qur'an, you look at these words, or you hear different ways of reciting certain things like Wadduha, Wadduhi, when you hear these things, these are all coming from the Prophet ﷺ. They're all coming from Allah Azza wa Jal. They're all revelation coming from Allah. Unlike the differences that you have in other religions and manuscripts, these differences are corruptions. So they're not coming from the source. The differences that you find in their manuscripts, they're not coming from the source. They are coming later on, added by individuals. Now, these differences that we're talking about in Qira'at, they're all coming from the Prophet ﷺ. They're all coming from Allah, and they're all considered Qur'an. And Allah Azza wa Jal said, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْهُ, recite that which is easy for you. So you can recite from these 7 different dialects, whatever is easy for you. From these words that are revealed, you can choose to say Malik if you want to say Malik. You can choose to say Malik if you want to say Malik. That's up to you. These are all things which are accessible because of the Prophet ﷺ. He gave you that permission. And the whole reason for them to be revealed is to make things easy for the people. So towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, because we said it was revealed in 23 years, towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, Angel Gabriel, he used to come to him every year. In Ramadan, he came to him 2 times. So at the end, when Angel Gabriel came to the Prophet ﷺ, he showed him the order of the verses of the Quran and the order of the chapters. So the order of the chapters of the Quran and the verses that we have today, that was given at the last final revelation. It was called Al-Awdatul Akhira, the last final revelation, or the last final showing. Well, Angel Gabriel came at the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ when the Quran was fully revealed. And he told him exactly where to place each chapter, exactly where to place each verse. and also any verses of the Quran that was abrogated. Because there was previous verses of the Quran that was revealed that was abrogated and caused to be forgotten. Like Allah Azza wa Jalla says in chapter 2, verse 106, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا. There is no verse that we abrogate or cause to be forgotten. So there were certain verses that were abrogated in the beginning or caused to be forgotten. So in that last final revelation, Angel Gabriel showed the Prophet ﷺ any verses that were abrogated to be removed, and the order of the verses of the Quran, etc., and how the Quran is to be. So that was the last final revelation of the Quran given by the Prophet ﷺ, and all of these instructions were given to the companions that this is how the Quran is, 114 chapters that we have today, and this is the order of the chapters, and this is the order of the verses. And now something to keep in mind is that this final last revelation had some verses, as we said, that were abrogated, that the Prophet ﷺ told the people that were abrogated. But if you remember before, we said some of the companions had their own masahif. So in these books that they had, their personal ones, perhaps some of them had some abrogated verses that they still did not remove, etc. So keep that in mind, because we'll come to that in the future, inshallah. So this was the first stage. This was the first stage of the revelation of the Quran. Quran coming down on a period of 23 years. The 7 ahruf, when Islam spread, so the 7 different dialects of the Arab, including some unique words that enriches and unique ways of reciting that enriches and make it easy for the people when they're reciting the Quran. Now, a couple of years later, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, came the time of the first Caliphate of Islam, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and there was a battle called the Battle of Yamama. And within that battle, there was a lot of the people who memorized the Quran at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Because when we said the Quran came in 23 years, whenever a verse was coming down, we said it was written down, it was also memorized by the people. There was multiple memorizers of the Quran, like the 4 people we mentioned, that the Prophet told the people to learn the Quran from, because there was this tradition of people learning the Quran, memorizing the Quran. So there was people who are called the memorizers of the Quran. And within the Battle of Yamama, which is like 2 years later or so, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, a lot of these reciters of the Quran died. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was another close companion of the Prophet ﷺ, came to the first Caliphate, Abu Bakr, and he told him that there is a lot of people who died in this battle, and I'm afraid that all of the reciters will die, and some of the Quran may be lost. So now he's talking in future tense. It's because, look, we've seen a lot of these reciters, they died. So I'm afraid that they will continue to die, and maybe a part of the revelation will be lost. So he made a suggestion to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq to collect the Quran in written form. Now, something very important here to understand is, look, the companions here clearly looked at the Quran as an oral text, because they looked at the main way of preservation at those people who were memorizers of the Quran. They didn't look at preservation to do with written text. That's why they didn't collect it from the beginning. They looked at it from an oral tradition, because people memorized the Quran and they were reciting it in each prayer. So there is no worry that it will be lost, and there was memorizers of the Quran, tens and thousands of memorizers of the Quran, so there is no worry for the Quran to be lost. But when they saw the primary method of preservation, which is the oral transmission, is in danger, those people who are memorizing the Quran, they're dying. So they thought of an alternative way, which is an extra way now, to just make sure as a backup to the oral tradition, is that let's also collect the written Quran. So what happened is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anh, he brought Zayd ibn Thabit, who was one of the people who wrote the revelation at the time of the Quran. He was also one of the memorizers of the Quran, and he was one of the people now that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he called and he said, okay, now I have a mission for you, collect these parchments that was written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So you're talking about the parchments and all of the rocks and the leather and all of these things that was written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So Zayd ibn Thabit, he went and he collected the Quran, the written Quran, the full written Quran, to be preserved and compiled with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And they had a very strict criteria. They said for each verse that you need to have, each person who will bring a verse and say this is a verse of the Quran, he needs to have 2 witnesses witnessing him take that revelation from the Prophet ﷺ. Even though they were already memorizing the whole Quran, but they still applied that criteria just to be completely sure and to have full transparency when it comes to the compilation of the Quran. For each verse, they required 2 witnesses to come and say that, like, we saw this specific verse, we saw this individual take the specific verse from the Prophet ﷺ directly. So this was now the second stage of the compilation of the Quran, which was to bring all of these parchments, which was written down at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the second measurement, as a backup plan, a plan of preservation, just out of worry of those reciters of the Qur'an that were dying. So these parchments and this Qur'an, which was written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, his life, was compiled and was preserved and was kept with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And this was the second stage of the preservation of the Qur'an. Now after that came second caliphate of Islam, Umar ibn Khattab, and then after him the third caliphate, Uthman ibn Affan, and Islam spread far and wide. Islam spread all over the world. And because Islam spread so far, keep in mind that, as we said, the Quran was revealed in these 7 different modes, these 7 different dialects of recitation. People were reciting the Quran orally. They were taking the Quran from their teachers, from the companions, etc. So just like Umar ibn Khattab, he used to say, and many of the companions, they said, Al-Qira'atu sunnatun muttaba'a. The Qira'ah is a tradition that you take from your teacher, from his teacher, going back to the Prophet ﷺ. So they were always taking the Quran orally. They never looked at the text as the means of taking the Quran. They only collected it as a backup plan for preservation, but they always took the Quran orally from their teachers, i.e. from the companions, from their teachers, etc., going back to the Prophet ﷺ from the source. So the people were reciting the Quran and learning from their teachers. So when Islam spread far and wide, those companions traveled to different lands. So you had a companion traveling to a specific land, and another companion traveled to a different land. And then the people in that land started learning the recitation from that companion. Now here there's something very important to explain and something very important to understand, is that if you understand this concept properly, you'll understand the ahraf and qira'at a lot more. There's something called the concept of choice. And that concept of choice is that when Allah Azza wa Jal revealed these 7 different dialects and modes of recitation with the words and enriching the meaning of the Quran, as we said in the beginning, He allowed people to recite whatever is easy for them. So what happened is the companions, for example, can recite a part of the first harf and a part of the second harf and a part of the third harf, because all of these different dialects, they are the Quran. They're all the same 114 chapters, but just different ways of reciting them. So a companion might recite 30% of the first dialect with 10% of the other dialect, etc. So these choices were completely open. He might say tabayyinu, another companion might choose tathabbatu. So those companions of the Prophet ﷺ could choose whatever is easy for them to recite. And that is what a qira'ah is. Now there's a difference between a qira'ah and a harf. So a qira'ah is the choices that a reciter makes. So you have the 7 different ahruf, and you can choose from these 7 different ahruf whatever is easy for you to recite. And then in the end, you end up with your own qira'ah. You end up with a qira'ah of the Quran. So all of these companions had their qira'ah, had their own recitations of the Quran, collected and combined from the 7 ahruf. Because as we said, these 7 ahruf are all revelation from Allah Azza wa Jalla. So a companion, he took 10% from one harf and 90% of another harf, and then he had his qira'ah. For example, Abdullah ibn Abbas had his qira'ah, Ubay ibn Ka'b had his qira'ah, etc. So these companions had their own qira'ah that they were reciting. And that's why if you look at the hadith of Umar ibn Khattab and Hisham ibn Hakim, which are 2 of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Hisham ibn Hakim was reciting a part of the Quran, and then Umar ibn Khattab, he heard him reciting. And then he heard him reciting something he didn't hear before, because they were all taking the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ. So he dragged him and he took him to the Prophet and he said, "Oh Prophet of Allah, look, I saw this person, this companion, reciting the Quran in a different way to what I heard from you." And this here shows 2 things. First, is if anyone tries to change the Quran, the companions straight away, they're alert because they know the source. They already memorized the Quran, so they know any differences when they hear them. That's number 1. Number 2, that they also come back to the Prophet ﷺ if there is any disagreement or there is any issues. So they're very alert to the preservation of the Quran, and that the preservation is oral. They come back to the Prophet ﷺ to see, okay, why is this person reciting differently to me? So then when Umar ibn Khattab brought him, and he recited the Quran in front of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet told Umar, "You also recite." Then Umar recited. Then the Prophet ﷺ, he told him, "You are right and you're right." These are different modes, different ways of recitation that are all coming down as a revelation from Allah. And you're allowed to choose to recite this way, and you're allowed to choose to recite that way. So this is the Prophet ﷺ telling these companions that you can have your qira'ah, you can have your choices from these 7 different dialects and modes of recitation and words. You can choose your choices, whatever is easy for you. As well as the other companion, he can also choose his choices. And then you end up with a qira'ah, you end up with the choices that you made, your own recitation, that are taken from what? From the 7 ahruf, that are all revelation and are all Quran. An easier way to bring it to the mind of the people listening is look at the Quran, for example. You have chapter 2 and chapter 3. Imagine if chapter 2 and chapter 3, they were one harf, chapter 2 is one harf, and chapter 3 is a different harf. So you take a part of chapter 2 and you recite with it a part of chapter 3. So you end up now with a new chapter, right? Other than chapter 2 and chapter 3, because they are combinations of these two. But in the end, what you end up with is just a combination of these two chapters of revelation. So what you end up with is also a revelation, because it is just combining these two chapters. This is how the ahruf works. This is how you come up with a qira'ah. You combine between the different ahruf, different dialects that were revealed, and you come up with a qira'ah in the end. So all of the companions had their qira'ah. And then when they traveled to different lands, because as we said, the Qur'an is taken orally, the people started learning the Qur'an from the companion in their city, in their country, in their land, the companions that were around them. So they took the Qur'an from those companions. So now the people who are learning the Qur'an, they can learn from two companions. And they can also do the same thing. They can have their own qira'ah by choosing some of the recitation of this companion, as well as some of the recitation of this different companion. So now you come up with a different qira'ah. But whatever they're combining from, and this is the important thing to understand, whatever a qira'ah you come up with, combining from different qira'at or from different ahruf, it is all in the end Qur'an that is coming from Allah Azza wa Jal, that you're just combining different parts of revelation with each other, reciting that which is easier for you, what is most eloquent and easier for your tongue. So there was tons of different qira'at. So the qira'at was not only limited to 7 or 10. There was many different qira'at. And the companions had their own qira'at, and the tabi'een, many of them had their own qira'at. And we'll come to that later on. So when these companions traveled and the people learned from them, at the time of the Caliphate of Islam, Uthman radiallahu anh, there was certain wars that are taking place. So the armies were coming from different lands. Now, when these armies came from different lands, there was a problem happening here. Because as we said, these companions had their own qira'ah. And in these lands, people were learning from the companions. So if Abdullah ibn Abbas was in one land, and Umar ibn Khattab was in a different land, the people in this land learned from Abdullah ibn Abbas, his qira'ah, and the people here learned from Umar ibn Khattab. So when the time of war came, and the people came from this land, and the people came from this land, now they have two different qira'at. Now they have two different recitations, because they took from two different companions. Even though it's all Qur'an, but the choices that these companions made from the 7 ahruf is different. So they will end up reciting the Qur'an slightly different from the other companion that is coming from the other land. Now, when these armies met, people started disagreeing with each other. They're saying to each other, what is this? This is not the Qur'an that was listening. And this happens even today. Now, if some Muslims go today, for example, to certain parts of the world, to Morocco, and they are reciting the recitation of Hafs, and they start listening to Warsh, then they don't recognize many of the words that are being said. So they think something is wrong here. If you're not aware, and these were new Muslims, bear in mind, because Islam spread far and wide. So a lot of them were new Muslims. So they were not aware of the 7 ahruf, and they were not aware of the concept of qira'at. So then there was disagreements happening between the people. So Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, he came to Uthman radiallahu anhu, and he said that the people are disagreeing about the qira'at. There's a problem happening here. People are disagreeing with each other because they learned from different companions their qira'ah, and now they're not understanding why someone else is reciting a different way. Even though all of these ways of recitation are in the end revelation coming from Allah Azza wa Jal. So what Uthman radiallahu anh did is he consulted the companions, and then he made a committee. And what he did is he made a standardized text of the Qur'an. Why did he make a standardized text of the Qur'an? So he can send to these lands and then say to the people that, look, whatever you're reciting, it has to be restricted to the standardized version of the Qur'an. So what this standardized version of the Qur'an does is two things. First, it restricts the recitations of the people, the choices that they can make to that standardized version of the Qur'an. And then if there is any disagreement, they can always come back to that specific standardized version of the Qur'an. Now, where did this standardized version come from? What Uthman radiallahu anhu did is he brought the same person, Zayd ibn Thabit, who Abu Bakr made compile the Qur'an in the stage that we spoke about before. He brought the same person, Zayd ibn Thabit, and he brought that compiled Qur'an that was written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, his life. And he used it to make that standardized text, the standardized version of the Qur'an. And then he did not put any dialectical marks. So people can recite multitude of different recitations of the Qur'an using that same text. So it's one text, but you can recite in different modes, different qira'at. You can use different qira'at to recite the same text. So that standardized text that was based on the same Qur'an that was written down at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in accordance to the final revelation that was revealed. And then what Uthman did is he sent it to different lands. He said he sent the standardized text to different lands. and then told the people that if they want to recite the Quran, they have to stick to that specific text. It does not have dialectical marks, so it can include multitude of different recitations. But you still restricted to whatever is in the text. You cannot go anywhere else. You're restricted to that specific text. So it kind of restricted the full 7 ahruf. So it's not all of them right now. So there is a restricted version of them, restricted version of the 7 ahruf. And something that is very important to understand here is that any harf is enough. As the Prophet ﷺ said, كُلُّهَا كَافٍ شَافٍ. Each harf of it is enough. If we just have one recitation or one harf of the Quran, that is enough for people, because all of it is Quran in the end, and all of it is the 114 different chapters. But it's just different ways of reciting these 114 different chapters. So that skeletal text of Uthman radiallahu anhu that does not have dialectical marks, you can have multitude of different qira'at that you can use to read that specific text. But as we said, something very important to understand. They never learned the Quran from the text, which is why Uthman radiallahu anhu, he left it without the dialectical marks, because you cannot just pick it and start reading a specific recitation. The learning was always oral, and the text was always secondary. So the purpose of the text is two things: to combine the people at one text, and if there is any disagreement, they can come back to it. That was the only reason Uthman radiallahu anhu made that standard text. And then what Uthman radiallahu anhu also did is he burnt any other copies. Now, what copies did he burn? He burnt these personal masahif that we mentioned in the beginning. We said in the beginning, different companions had their own personal masahif, and they had interpretation in there, etc. So what Uthman radiallahu anhu did, he said, bring any of these masahif, personal masahif of the people, and we're going to remove them. We're just going to leave that standard text so people can come back to it, and do not go to multitude of different sources. There's only one source to come back to. Now, a very important point to note here as well is we mentioned the Quran or the parchments that was written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, his life. These parchments were still preserved even after Uthman made the standard text. So these parchments was there. Uthman did not burn this, or if you want to call it original, he did not burn these original parchments. In fact, he made the standardized version. He burned the personal masahif, but he did not burn this parchments that were written at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They remained until 50 to 60 AH, which is like 20 or 30 years later after Uthman radiallahu anhu. But he didn't burn at that time. They were still available. All he did is that he made a standard text with the agreement of all of the companions, like Ali radiallahu anhu did, that whatever Uthman did was under supervision of all of us. So it was not a personal decision that Uthman radiallahu anhu made. And Uthman radiallahu anhu and all of the four caliphates, the Prophet ﷺ told us to follow their way and their tradition. So that standard text was then made, and then it solved this idea of disagreement of different people coming from different parts of the land disagreeing on different recitations that they took from the companions. So now here, the people are restricted to the text, but there's still many recitations that you can recite using that text, because the text does not have dialectical marks. You can recite Malik, you can recite Malik, you can recite Tabayyanu, you can recite Tathabbatu, and you can recite these different words using the same text. You can say Wadduha, you can say Wadduhi. So there was still tons of different qira'at available, but people are still restricted to one text, one skeletal text that they come back to when it comes to the recitations of the Qur'an. And this is the third stage of the recitations of the Qur'an and the preservation of the text. The final stage of the recitations of the Qur'an. Now, after we said there's a skeletal text now, which is the text that Uthman radiallahu anhu standardized and he sent to different lands. And now there's, as we said, tons of different qira'at that people took from the companions and then from the students. So the companions combined from the 7 ahruf, and then their students combined from different companions, and then the students of the students combined from different students. And all of it is combining from revelation, coming with different qira'at. So there was multitude of different qira'at. So later on in history, there was an individual called Ibn Mujahid. And Ibn Mujahid, he was a scholar in the Quran and recitations of the Quran. What Ibn Mujahid did is he looked, where is the best recitations of the Quran? So there is multitude of different recitations. So let me look at the best reciters, the people who are most eloquent in the recitation, most eloquent in their understanding of the Arabic language, have the best chains tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ, the most authentic chains. And what he did is he took 7 of these recitations, and he wrote a book about these 7 different recitations. So he took 7 different recitations, not the ahruf. He said the ahruf are different. A recitation is combining between different ahruf or recitations of the companions. So he collected in that book 7 recitations, not 7 ahruf, 7 recitations. And that book of the 7 recitations, he collected the most eloquent and the best recitations that he found in the time. People did not have to follow that book, did not have to take information from that book. That was just a personal decision that he made, Ibn Mujahid. So this was not like Muslims have to follow this or something. There were still many other different recitations that people were reciting and taking. But what happened later on is that book became so popular, and then the people started restricting themselves to these 7 different recitations. And a lot of people had a misconceptions. They thought that the 7 recitations of Ibn Mujahid is the same as the 7 ahruf, which we've already highlighted. They're completely 2 different things. And that's why many of the scholars blamed Ibn Mujahid. They said he could have collected 8 recitations or 6 recitations or 20 recitations. Why did he have to choose 7? Which confused many of the people, thinking that these 7 recitations are the 7 ahruf. So these 7 recitations became widely popular among the people, among the population. People started reciting these 7 ahruf of the Qur'an. So some of the scholars also came later on, and what they did is to clear that misunderstanding as well, they added extra 3 recitations from the eloquent reciters of the Qur'an, the people who have the best chains, etc., the most understanding of the Arabic language. And they added extra 3 recitations of the Qur'an, like Ibn al-Jazari in his book An-Nashf al-Qira'at al-Ashr. So then we have now 10 recitations, these 10 eloquent recitations. Now, as we said, these recitations are all what? They're combinations of the different ahruf. They're combinations of the revelation that came from the companions. They're combinations from the oral text. And all of the oral text traces back to the Prophet ﷺ with chains of narration. So the 10 recitations that we're reciting today, they were not the only recitations available, as we said. There was tons of other recitations. The only reason that they are popular today is because it became popular later on. People started adopting them because of their eloquency. People started adopting them and started following them and reciting them. But, however, there was many, many, many different recitations of the Quran. And something interesting for people to understand, that even today, if you become a scholar of Qur'at and highly eloquent in the Arabic language, etc., you can even have a new Qur'ah. You can combine between these 10 different Qur'at. So even today, you're not restricted to the 10 different Qur'at. Why? Because all of them are Qur'an. All of them are revelation. All of them are coming from Allah Azza wa Jal. All of them, for us, are considered Qur'an. These recitations of the Qur'an, the 10 different recitations of the Qur'an, they are highly mass transmitted. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of chains of narrations, transmitting these 10 recitations of the Qur'an, tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ. Now we have voluminous works that has the names and biographies of the people in the chain, the people transmitting the information. Not the information itself, but just the people transmitting the information, autobiographies of them. Like, for example, Al-Daw al-Lami', Al-Halaqat al-Mudi'a, or An-Nashr fi al-Qira'at al-Ashr, or Tabaqat al-Qurra. All of these are books which contain the biographies of the narrators of the Quran. And now the chains themselves are available as well. You can see them in An-Nashr fi al-Qira'at al-Ashr and in Tabaqat al-Qurra, where you have a multitude. We're talking about mass transmission. So individuals in the chain reporting these 10 different eloquent qira'at, tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ. And anyone today who recites any of the qira'at has something which is called ijazah. I'm going to show an example of it on the screen. An ijazah is you have a certificate, and this certificate has the names of your teachers of one of the 10 qira'at that you recite, the names of your teachers going back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. And today we have millions of these. Millions of memorizers of the Quran. We have millions of certificates of ijazah of people transmitting that same text. Now, it is very important to understand that whichever qira'ah you recite the Quran with, it is considered Quran, because there are combinations from the 7 ahraf, which are all coming from Allah Azza wa Jal. And the purpose of them is to just make the Quran easy for people to memorize, easy for people to understand. So today, we have this mass transmission of hundreds of thousands, of millions of certificates of people transmitting these 10 different recitations of the Quran that we read. So there is not a shadow of a doubt when it comes to the oral preservation of the Quran, is that these 10 recitations that we're reciting are Quran and are combinations of the 7 ahraf, which is the Quran, the revelation that is coming from Allah Azza wa Jal. So when we say the Quran is preserved letter for letter, word for word, yes, it is preserved letter for letter, word for word, because each of the recitations is Quran, and each letter and each vowel and each way to recite is Quran. So the Quran is preserved letter for letter, word for word, vowel for vowel, and will always be preserved in that way. But just many people, they do not understand the concept of ahruf and qira'at, which causes confusions sometimes for people when they're perceiving the different recitations of the Quran. And now when you understand the history behind it, the history behind the development of the qira'at, and that they are combinations of the ahruf that were read, recited by the Prophet ﷺ, and were revelation coming down directly from Allah Azza wa Jal, and they were the same 114 chapters with very slight different dialects of recitation and differences that enriches and increases the meaning of the Quran. Now, what about the written text? So regarding the written text, do we have any evidences that the written text is also preserved? Now, as we said, the Quran was always the oral text, and through my explanations you saw why it was the oral text. This is how the companions understood it. There was always these chains of narrations being preserved because we always looked at it as an oral text. But even the written text, if you look at it, it's also another sign of the preservation of the Quran. For example, you have the Birmingham manuscript, which is a parchment that was either written on the life of the Prophet ﷺ or his companions. That if you compare it with what we have today, it is the exact thing that we have today. And this parchment is very likely could be one of the parchments that the Prophet ﷺ asked one of the companions to come and write down when the revelation was coming down, because it's from his lifetime. And it is exactly in accordance to what we read today. Now you have the top copy manuscript of the Quran, which has the same exact Quran that we're reciting today. When we're talking about the written text, it has the same text as the Uthmanic text. There is no difference. This Uthmanic skeletal text is the same exact thing. But you have the Sana'a manuscript. And the Sana'a is very interesting because the Sana'a, when it was discovered, is 15,000 different parchments. That traces to almost 950 different Qurans from the 1st century onwards. And when you look at all of these manuscripts, they show only one thing, that the Quran that we're reciting today is the same Quran that was there from the beginning. There was many non-Muslim textual criticism scholars who went to Sana'a and examined the Sana'a manuscripts. And I'll put names now of some of them who examined and who didn't examine, that all of them say that the Quran that we have today is the same Quran that existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So some of the names that I'm going to put of these non-Muslims, they went and they actually investigated and written books actually about the Sana'a manuscript and how they show the preservation of the Quran. Okay, now what about the Sana'a manuscript and the fact that there is something called an upper text and a lower text? And a lot of people don't understand what is this upper text and lower text and why is there differences. So as we said in the beginning, the Quran was written on what? Parchments and bones and whatever was accessible. So people didn't have papers, so when they make a mistake, they throw it away and then bring a new paper. So what people used to do is they used to wipe down the ink on whatever they had. They used to wash it and then write again. So that is what is the upper and lower text that you find in some of these parchments regarding the Sana'a manuscript, is because those people who were writing down, they were wiping down the previous text and then writing a new text when they made a mistake on the same parchment, on the same bone. So that's why you might find slight disagreements there in the lower text when you look at the lower text, etc. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as we said, these were 950 different Qurans and 15,000 parchments. These were not scribes, professional scribes. Many of these parchments were people personally writing for their own benefit, like home or learning from their teachers, learning at a school, writing down. These were not professional scribes. So they will have scribal errors because they're not professional scribes. But how do we know that these are scribal errors and not changes in the text? There's a very simple way that any beginner textual criticism scholars know, is that you look at the text, you look at any change or difference within that text, and then you compare it with the something older than it, a text older than it, or a text from the same time, or a text that came later on. So if you look at the text from the same time, text from before and text that came later on, has the same chapter, but does not have this extra mistake. So now you realize that this is not corruption, this is a scribal error, because that error has not been copied later on. Before it's not there. Other manuscripts from the same time does not have it, and manuscripts later on does not have it. So now we know that this is a scribal error. But if you compare with other religions, for example, the Christian tradition, you see that error is repeated in manuscripts later on. So you realize that there is a corruption taking place because that change now has been copied and copied and copied and copied and copied in later manuscripts, and then have been put in the Bible and people are reading. This is how you know that there is a corruption. But the scribal error, on the other hand, you can know it's a scribal error, but looking at previous manuscripts from the same time and manuscripts later on, do they contain that same mistake? If they don't, then this specific parchment, this specific writer, who is not a scribe, made a mistake. So even, but this is the thing that I'm saying, even though you can you can look at the upper text and the lower text, and you can look at certain scribal errors, the conclusion of scholars, talking about non-Muslim scholars, secular scholars, who went and studied the Sana'a manuscripts and written works on it, their conclusion is the same. The Qur'an is preserved, and these manuscripts, whatever error it could have, a manuscript could have from the 8th century or the 9th century or whatever it is, any errors or mistakes that these were scribal errors, and we can prove it because we can show you manuscripts, other manuscripts from the same time, before and after, that does not have that same mistake, which shows that the Qur'an is preserved, even, we're talking about, from the written text. So now, whether you want to look at the written text or you want to look at the oral text, there's only one conclusion that you can come to, is that the Qur'an that we have today is perfectly preserved. It is absolutely perfectly preserved from the oral text. We don't even have to rely on any of these written manuscripts, because yes, someone can write and make a mistake, so what? Does not mean anything. And this is not the case. We're saying even if this happens, this does not mean anything. But even that is not the case. Whether you look at written manuscripts of the Qur'an and you compare them to what we have today, or you look at the oral tradition of the Qur'an with these mass transmissions of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions today of certificates that trace back the Qur'an to the Prophet ﷺ, the Qur'an is preserved and will always be preserved. And we are in Ramadan right now. It is a chance for anyone watching to see this preservation with their own eyes. You can go to any mosque in Ramadan, or most mosques. Let's not say any mosque. Maybe a mosque is shut down or something. Most mosques around the world, and you will see that these mosques are reciting the Quran, 30 parts of the Quran from memory. And any mistakes that they would make, they will be corrected. And you will also see that these mosques are reciting the Quran in different recitations, the 10 different recitations that we talked about. So you can travel anywhere in the world today and look with your own eyes and see the living preservation of the Quran. So this tradition of reciting the Quran was always there and will always be there until the Day of Judgment. And the Quran will always be preserved. And we know that there is a lot of other religions and a lot of different faiths that are envious of this fact. But these are the facts. These are the primary source materials, and these are testimonies from people who are unbiased. Looking at either the oral text or the written text, they have to come to the same conclusion, that the Quran that we're reciting today is preserved the same way that the Prophet ﷺ received it from Allah Azza wa Jalla.
إن الذين كفروا بالذكر لما جاءهم وإنه لكتاب عزيز لا يأتيه الباطل من بين يديه ولا من خلفه تنزيل من حكيم حميد.